while Jubilee is a concrete set of practices, it also is a set of practices that set our imagination on a different kind of trajectory. I think Isaiah does that so beautifully when he was imagining a new city, the way a city could work better, work differently. And Jubilee was absolutely part of what he was dreaming and imagining.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Money is never neutral. It's theological because it tells a story about who belongs, who gets protected, and who gets trapped. In Scripture, Jubilee isn't an abstract idea. It's concrete and disruptive. Debts released, people set free, land returned, communities given a chance to start again. In this episode, I'm joined again by Kelley Nikondeha to talk about Jubilee Economics and what happens when we take Jesus at his word. Kelley shares a story from Burundi, where a fire destroys the central market, everything gone in a few hours. People go to bed as business owners and wake up poor. The question becomes immediate. What does good news sound like when your inventory is ash and your loan is still due? The response wasn't a slogan. It was neighbor love with a plan. Food, presence, grief, then real paths back into the economy. That story reshapes how we hear Jesus in Luke 4. When he announces good news to the poor and release to the captives, he's not speaking in spiritual metaphors. He's naming the economic weight people carry in their bodies. And he's doing it in a world where saying that out loud was dangerous. This conversation is about practicing Jubilee now. Small, costly choices that make room for people to breathe, break cycles of debt, and love our neighbors in ways that actually change lives. So join us for this conversation around Jubilee Economics. Here is my conversation with Kelley Nikondeha. Kelley, welcome back to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you back on.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be back.
I'm excited to jump into Jubilee Economics, your new book. For the listeners, I'd love for you just to give us a brief overview of what Jubilee is, what it's about, and why it's important.
So Jubilee is actually a set of economic practices, very concrete practices. So when I first heard about Jubilee growing up, it was about, liberation and setting people free. It wasn't until I got older and, our understanding of the world thickens that I actually realized that, Jubilee isn't just this beautiful operatic idea that we hear about with the prophet Isaiah, but it actually is a very concrete set of policies that have to do with loans, labor, and land. And the specific policy that I think most people first trip over is the idea of collective debt forgiveness. Because one of the big things, if you know anything about Jubilee, you know that on the 50th year, when the shofar is blown, everybody's debt gets forgiven. And, if that's the top line, there's been a lot of questions about, well, that's not realistic. And did that ever really happen? And are there any receipts for that? And that's just utopian rhetoric. I mean, that's a lot of what I grew up with, when I first started learning about Jubilee. But my husband and I do development work overseas. And so actually for us, we really cared not just about liberation in the operatic tones, but what it actually, we were looking for concrete wisdom for the kind of work that we do. And so as I dug deeper into the text, we see that Moses was having these conversations about neighborliness and what it was going to look like when they moved into the promised land. And among them was these deep conversations about indebtedness, that there was this recognition that if anything was really going to destroy the neighborliness that they had built as they traveled through the desert, it was going to be debt. And so conversations that we see both in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus talk about these practices of freeing people from debt, which actually it's not commercial debt, it's personal debt, releasing people from their indebtedness, conversations around labor, it's letting people go free. But again, people who were enslaved because of their indebtedness. They were in right servants. They became somebody's servant because they owed them a debt they couldn't repay, or land that was lost in the rough and tumble of the economy. So when that shofar blew, yes, debts were forgiven. People got to go back home. They were no longer enslaved, and they got the land back, the family land that had been lost. Well, that is good news. I mean, there's a reason that Jesus preached about it in Luke 4 and said, this is good news for the poor. You get your money, you get your, that weight of indebtedness is relieved. But of course, it also is hard news because somebody is not going to get repaid. Somebody has to let go of the land deed. So I've always felt like Jubilee, these practices are both good news for the poor, but they are really challenging or hard news for those of us who have a different standing in the economy. But as I started to really lean in to the deeper history beyond the biblical text, because the question was always, well, this was not practiced. We don't have receipts for this, as a way to kind of say we don't need to really do it. Because I think people have a gut sense that if this really is something we're called to do, if this is a true biblical imperative, whoa, that is going to trouble the waters. And so as I looked, actually, we do have receipts. They're not really in the text as such, although I see winks and hints throughout the text, which I explore. But actually, if we look back to Sumer and Assyria and Babylon, we actually do see actual records, artifacts that show us that debts were forgiven. That when a new emperor would come in, one of the first things he would do is announce, he would say, I'm going to proclaim justice. Proclaiming justice was debt forgiveness, which I also think opens the door to some very interesting conversations, that the biblical idea of justice is more rooted in that understanding. It's about economic justice, but they would proclaim justice. And yes, it would curry favor with the new leader because everybody, could lighten the load. But there were also some very practical reasons about recalibrating economies that had gotten stuck or hung up. And at some point, the only thing you could really do was to wipe the debt clean and start over. And there were some other reasons, they were trying to make sure that there wasn't a rising creditor class that could rival them and compete for power. There were all those dynamics, but we actually do have records that this was practiced by all the neighbors that would have been around the tribes of Israel, and they would have been pulling from these traditions. Now, what I now know is that Israel did innovate. They brought some fresh ideas, but they were pulling from things that were already happening around them, and they didn't feel the need to give us receipts. First of all, the Bible is a theological document, right? But also, they didn't even need to prove it or let us know how it happened because it was happening everywhere around them. So that was like answering a question nobody was asking at the time. But now we can look back and say, oh, there were receipts. And so this was practiced. And so kind of how does that then push us to think about Jubilee and economics? For us as development practitioners, we think about it all the time because we're working in one of the poorest economies in the world, in East Africa. But it also has implications for us. There is no part of our life that economics don't really touch, right?
So how do we think about Jubilee in a Western economic mindset, as opposed to maybe how it was lived back in the day? What are we getting that throws us off because of our place and our time in history? If you're running a business, you know the weight. You're the visionary, the problem solver, the one who keeps it all moving. But the truth is, you can't grow when you're buried in the doing. What if you could multiply your results by finally handing off the work that's holding you back? That's what Sidekick makes possible. They match business owners with world-class virtual assistants, real humans, not AI, skilled professionals who bring focus, follow-through, and freedom to your business for 60 to 70% less than hiring locally. So stop carrying it all alone. Head to getyoursidekick.com/shiftingculture and book a call to see how Sidekick can help you scale your business, reclaim your time, And finally, breathe again.
Sure. Well, I'll start off with a story. It's kind of one of the ones that anchors the book, but it's when I started to have to wrestle with the very question you are asking. So we had started a bank for the working poor. So Burundi, which is the country where my husband is from, 97% of the population is unbanked. Don't have a bank account. Keep the money in a little coffee can buried in their closet or in their backyard. That's what my mother-in-law used to do. So they don't have access to any of the basic banking things that you know, savings or safe place to put your money, etc. So we started a bank for them to help get them into the economy. And we were maybe 6 months old, so we were a very young financial institution, but we were credentialed through the central bank. I mean, we had to go through all of the paperwork, took us a year to get all the documents in place and be approved and be able to take deposits, etc. 6 months in, there's a fire in the central market. This is like the heart of Burundi's economy. All the goods came in, from the port and from other countries into this marketplace, and they went out, to all the other little rural upcountry markets. But this was the hub. The fire on a Sunday morning burned this entire marketplace to the ground in about 5 hours. And luckily it was a Sunday morning, so there weren't many people in it. Most of them were getting ready to go to church, but it destroyed it destroyed the economy. But it also was a challenge for us because 70% of the people that were banking with us in our new little enterprise, 70% of them, their business was in that market. Their inventory, that was their location, that was the place that they had, that was all their inventory. And a lot of them still had their little cash boxes in there because they were learning to trust us. So they didn't have all of their money with us yet. They were, so they also lost money. And my thought was, well, this is when Jubilee comes into practice because the Bible says you forgive the debt, right? This is what Jubilee for these people would be, is we're a bank. We can write off the debt. And my husband said, if we did that, we would have our certificate of operation pulled so quickly by the central bank. We'd be shut down because you actually can't do that as a banking institution in Burundi or anywhere else, right? And that was when I first realized that I couldn't have that very wooden, if it happened this way in the Bible, it has to happen this way now. That we are talking about, an ancient world versus a modern world, very different economic dynamics. And so I had to be willing to think differently. And, my first thought was, oh my gosh, have we kind of gone into the land that is beyond Jubilee? Is Jubilee no longer efficacious in our world? Does it no longer have any meaning other than a metaphor? And that really frightened me because I was like, I really believed this. So I was really frightened that maybe we were moving beyond the reach of Jubilee and the wisdom of the text. But for me, part of that journey, my husband had to work on the ground with the actual people who had lost. And that's a story in and of itself. But for me as a theologian, it was, okay, so if Jubilee isn't in our current world, the ability to wipe off the debt as a bank, what does that look like? And so part of what we discovered in the next set of years was actually Jubilee is about re-entering the economy after, that nobody should be permanently locked out. If that 50-year cycle tells us something, that every 50 years, there needs to be some kind of a reset. I mean, that was their understanding, but I think that still holds true, this idea that there is always going to be an ebb and flow in our economy, whether it's natural disaster. I mean, for them, it was famines or pestilence or war, things, right? There's always things, or the loss of a patriarch or these kinds of things. But what do we have here? We had COVID, which shut down modern economies. We've had hurricanes that have shut down entire regions of our country. Like, there are just these big things that are going to impinge as well as personal things on the dynamics of our economies. And so to have that understanding that there always needs to be mechanisms for reset, because this is the truth of the economy. That is one thing that for all the people who talk about Jubilee being utopian, I actually find it's quite clear-eyed in its recognition that the economy undulates, it moves like this, and we have to have ways to let people back in after the rough and tumble of a bad set of years. And those things might feel drastic, but that is what is gonna meet the moment. So I think Jubilee speaks to that need for reset. It speaks to the fact that nobody should be permanently locked into poverty. I think it speaks to the importance of reentry, that there need to be viable ways for people to get back in after they've been kicked out or get in at all. I mean, I know in Burundi, we have a huge problem with youth employment. That's getting them in the economy to begin with. And I think we have similar challenges here. I think there are these deeper movements in the jubilary canon, that push us to think about all of these kinds of things that are all part of how we engage with our economy as individuals, as organizations, especially if we want to see transformational work in our communities.
I think with some people, especially in our individualistic Western culture,
Yeah.
I actually think that I think most people think that the system of insurance deals with some of those issues, saying that, hey, if you're responsible enough to get the insurance or the hurricane insurance, the flood insurance, whatever
Right.
type of insurance it is, that you are secure against whatever, you have FDIC insurance in your bank. So right? And so there's an insurance system, but it feels like, hey, if I'm good enough as an individual, I'm going to opt into some of that. How much of that insurance system is Jubilee adjacent? How much of it is
Mhm.
still systemic problems that actually keep people in poverty? How do we deal with an insurance system? I know, like in Burundi, they probably
Yeah.
don't have an insurance system at all. I know,
Uh,
when I lived in Jordan, we didn't have an insurance system. Like
mhm.
they don't do it at all.
Right.
So for us, so let's think about it wider. Like how do we reckon with like insurance and that getting people back on their feet? Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening and thank you for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show and get early ad-free episodes, you go to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com. And with your subscription, you could have a private podcast feed in your podcast app where you get to download early episodes before anybody gets to listen to them. You could also support the show by going to the support the show link at the bottom of the show notes in the app that you're using right now. That goes to a page that supports the work my wife and I do around the world. That donation is also tax deductible. So if you want a tax deductible donation, you could go there. Or if you want to support the show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really helps new listeners find the show as well. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you so much for supporting this work so that we could see the body of Christ look more like Jesus.
Right. Well, I think insurance, obviously, I mean, I have insurance on my house and on my car, right? I mean, we opt into these systems and they do provide some measure of help when things go sideways. But as you said, you have to have the capacity to buy in. You have to have you have to know to buy in, which sounds like a simple thing, but I know a lot of folks who, if they don't have a healthy family system, they don't know that you buy in to this. I had to teach my kids. I'm teaching them now. I have 2 young adults about buying into car insurance and what is that like. Somebody has to teach you to opt in. Then you have to have the financial capacity to do that and to maintain that. I mean, when my daughter found out how much a month you pay for car insurance, she's like, I don't know if I can afford to drive once I stop, yeah, as a mom paying. And I'm like, Yeah, like, right, but so I think it speaks to a bit about our social location. Some of us are located in places where we can opt in and we can sustain that, and that help insurance can be helpful. But that is not the story for everybody, and so when you talk, like you said, about the systemic issues, it doesn't help helps a lot of us, but doesn't help all of us. And I think I've started hearing stories coming out of Florida and a little bit out of California, where now insurance companies are saying, "Wow, there are some things happening, right, with climate change that are really changing our capacity as a insurance institution to be able to back you because you live in a flood zone, you live in a fire zone." Like, so even those mechanisms, while they can be helpful, they do have their limits.
If Jubilee is something and it's like a reset after 50 years, you thinking about this fire in Burundi of the central markets, what does re-entering the economy, what does resetting start to look like practically for you on the ground when you're actually working with real people with real debt and real poverty?
Well, again, I'll tell a little bit of the story because that's what I part of what I am a lay economist. The thing that makes me most nervous about having this conversation with you this morning is I am not an economist. I'm a theologian and an armchair no, I'm more than an armchair practitioner, but I'm not an economist, but I have engaged in the economy over the last 17 years. So, when the fire happened on the Sunday, Monday morning, when my husband went to the bank, and at that time we just had the one little branch, we now have 12, but back then we just had the one. There were about 40 women at the gate waiting to get in. So he goes, he unlocks the gate, and he tells them to go to the back where we had an outdoor training area with chairs and, et cetera, shaded area. And so the women went out there and they just started sharing their stories about, wow, we lost everything. We lost everything. And one of them stood up and said, "I went to bed on Saturday night as a businesswoman." She was she had she was starting to make money and contribute to her family and had a sense of pride about that. But she says, "I woke up Sunday morning and I was poor again." Like, it was that dramatic to her that night and day, that before and after the fire. And so these women went around and they shared their story and they supported each other and they cried together and, you know, Claude had, donuts and Fanta brought in, and they just sat for hours, weeping together. But then came, "Okay, what are we gonna do about it?" Now, these women represented the most precarious of all of our clients, what we would call high-risk borrowers. They didn't have any collateral. And so they were gonna be the hardest ones to get back in. And on top of that, we also had people who were in the hospital because some of them were there on Sunday morning and had to escape and got burns and so the first plan was, is everybody okay? So all the loan officers were charged with find out where your people are. If they're in the hospital, you go and you visit them, and you don't ask about the money, you don't ask about you ask if they're okay. You ask if their family's okay. We got together bunches of food, and it was like, we deliver food to everybody's house, all of our people. Make sure they have a bag of rice, make sure they have cassava, make sure they have beans, because and again, he kept telling them, "Don't ask them about the loan. We are caring for people. These are our neighbors," right? There is the immediate sense of actually caring for the well-being of one another. Then for the next 3 months, each loan officer met with their portfolio of people, and they came up with individualized plans. What do you need to get back into the economy? Now, some of our folks who had a little more capacity and were a little further along in their journey were like, hey, I can bring more stuff in from Kenya. I just need can we extend the time horizon for us to repay the loan? And can we maybe get a little bump, to just get a little advance to get us, and so everybody had a very individualized plan of what they needed, whether it was the time horizon, an advance, lowering the rate so that they could, like everybody had a way to get back in. And I mean, I think that was really crucial, that everybody got time and got an individualized plan. And then there were these high-risk mamas, and no they did not know how they were gonna get back in, and they were the one that Jubilee requires a fair amount of creativity. And, it was, "Okay, how do we help them?" Because the collateral was a big issue. If we were gonna extend fresh loans to them, they needed more I mean, all these things we had to demonstrate to the central bank. And so that was where we brought in people to do some fundraising, to create a fund that would basically be their guarantee. We had to bring in people like carpenters to help them rebuild kiosks in other markets, like the very basics of they actually need help building a new stand in a new place. Maybe they were just selling mandarins or tomatoes or mangoes, so it wasn't like they were bringing product in from abroad, but they actually needed the hardware and they needed help. So we had a fund that helped them and other women from other banks, actually. We had enough that we were able to help others get back in. And so for us, like every context is going to be different. But the Bible talks about, part of Jubilee is when you set somebody free, you don't just set them free and say, God bless. The biblical imperative is that you actually have to give them some things to walk away with, something that they can rebuild with, some money. I mean, remember with the conversations about reparations is that, when slaves were set free, they were supposed to get what, 40 acres and a mule? It was that recognition that you can't just tell people you're free and then not give them any means to rebuild and reenter the economy. And so that same thing, I think, is part of the Jubilee conversation is how do we, and every context will be different. But for us, it was carpenters and loan rearrangements and bags of food and, checking in on people and, that their well-being as a person mattered.
It would be really nice. I'd love to have 40 acres and a mule. Right now.
Right.
That would be that would be great.
Right? I don't know
But
about the mule, but I could take the 40
I could
acres.
take the 40 acres. I could definitely take the 40 acres. The question for me then is like you're talking about this economic system, debt repayment and forgiveness. How do you think that if you now see the Jubilee passage in Isaiah 61 as an economic passage, how do you
Mhm.
see Jesus as he rolls out that scroll in Isaiah
Yeah,
and Luke chapter 4 and he shares this passage and says that this has been fulfilled in your hearing?
yeah.
How does like seeing that as an economic passage even
Mhm.
shift the way that we view the ministry of Jesus and what he's trying to say?
I think it's quite fundamental to my understanding of the Gospels at this point, because if we understand Luke and the story Luke is trying to tell about Jesus and Jesus's work, the inaugural sermon is about an economic practice? Like, right? It's like, "What?" That it's not about discipleship, it's not about the 4 spiritual laws, it's not about, going to heaven. Like, the first thing he says is that the good news is somehow rooted in an economic practice? Like, okay, let's back up and rethink this. And I think that really what Jesus was doing was inviting them into a jubilee campaign, a jubilary way of seeing the world. So I think part of the backdrop that we often don't calculate is that for all the centuries prior and the empires prior, debt relief was practiced. You could assume that at some point relief was coming your way or coming to your kids if not you. Rome was very different. Rome was one of the first empires, at least in this area, in the Levant, that said, we're not practicing debt forgiveness as an empire. They were fine with empowering a creditor class. I mean, think about the rich young ruler, right? They were fine with actually empowering that dynamic. And so there was no talk of debt forgiveness in Rome. And a matter of fact, there started to come out stories that if a public figure talked aloud about debt forgiveness, they were done. They were gone. They were killed. And so this is part of the backdrop where Jesus standing up in the synagogue and saying that debt forgiveness was actually part of the good news he wanted to talk about. These were dangerous words for him to say in a public space to a bunch of poor people, because all of his neighbors in Nazareth, in that region, would have been impoverished. And it would have been good news to them, but it would have been dangerous news for the rabbis. It would have been dangerous news for some of the higher ups in the little town that wanted to avoid Rome breathing down their neck. And so I think that's an interesting way. At the end of that passage, we see that Jesus gets pushed to the end of a cliff. And there's a few other things in the story that are happening, but I now read that and think, yeah, part of the reason was probably to scare him within an inch of his life. Because if he keeps saying stuff like that, Rome is going to notice. And we see what Rome does. We see it in neighboring Sepphoris. They come in, they decimate the place, they take the kids as slaves, they rape and pillage the women, they kill them. Like, we don't want Rome to see or know what's happening in our little hamlet. So let's scare this guy within an inch of his life so that he will not, draw attention. These were dangerous times, even a violent economy, right? Rome wasn't only a dangerous military, it was a dangerous economic terrain, because without debt relief, it was a kind of violence. And I think we see this in our own country as more people are struggling with indebtedness and so many supports, so many of our social network, social underpinnings are being questioned. It does feel like we are doing violence economically to one another. And that was certainly the terrain. And so into that, Jesus just lobs this grenade of, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about the thing that you guys all carry, which is the weight of indebtedness. And I think when you think about it that way, I've talked to friends who aren't even followers of Jesus, who are like, man, if somebody sat and told me that we are going to talk seriously about the stress that my body holds because of the debt, the mortgage and the student loans for my kids and the money I owe here and here, man, I would listen to that person, because they're talking about something that materially affects the quality of my life. And I think that's where, oh man, Jesus knew exactly where people were. He knew exactly what the stress they were under, and he spoke right to it. And he says, we have to talk about debt. That is, and so then you look at the Lord's Prayer where, how do we pray? Well, we pray about the food that we eat every day. SNAP benefits, hello? Does that matter to people? Price of groceries, sure. But we also pray about indebtedness. Now, I was raised Catholic, and I was taught the prayer that Lord, forgive us our transgressions, right? Well, transgressions is a different kind, like maybe I hurt somebody's feelings or we gossiped or whatever. But actually the root of that prayer is money debts. Lord, Jesus wants us to pray that our indebtedness will be forgiven and that we will forgive the debts that other people owe us, that we will break the system. If you ever have watched Game of Thrones, this is where let's break the wheel, right? I want to be the kind of person who not only has relief from the debt I carry, but I'm the kind of person who will not entangle other people in that very cycle of indebtedness. And all of a sudden, right, I start to see Jesus was very much an economic practitioner, talking about debt, talking about not entangling each other in debt. So, these were not easy policies even then. A lot of the leading Jewish minds were trying to find ways around Jubilee practices. How can we get out of it? And I don't think that that wasn't what Jesus was about. He was like, no, we need to talk about money. We need to talk about debt. We need to be opting out of the system wherever we can. And I think this is something that really, when Jesus says this Jubilee starts today, well, I don't think he meant he could topple Rome and Rome's economic policies, but we could start a grassroots. We could start, So I have a friend who well, we have had a few friends both here and in Burundi who have lived with us during hard seasons in their life, and by giving them, a place to live and not charging them, we have given them breathing room so that they can collect themselves before they get out, right? Just recently, we had a conversation. One of our friends is renting a home from us, and, I don't know if I can afford it anymore. So we go back to the drawing board and say, well, we don't want her to go into debt. So how do we protect her? What can we do? And we figured out a way to kind of just feel like, in a phone call, it's like, oh, tell her we can, if we do this and we do, we can do these things where she can stay in a good place to live at a threshold that she can afford. And we've just had some things lighten up on our end so we can absorb a little. Like, this is not how you make money, but this is how you are neighbors to one another, right? Where we are like, how do we make sure, like, how do I not entangle people in debt to me? And so I think these are some of the ways we can start thinking and practicing Jubilee. And then before you know it, you are becoming a Jubilee practitioner. You are starting to see things differently.
I think even in Luke 4, as they're hearing Jesus talk, they're getting really excited about what he's
Yeah.
saying, right? Because
Yeah.
it's when you think about my debt being forgiven,
Yeah.
that's easy,
Yeah.
right? Because I'm thinking about
Yes.
myself of like, oh, that alleviates a lot of pressure. And then Jesus goes on to say, it's really not just about you, it's for all people. It's for,
Yeah.
remember the Syrians and remember the the
Yeah.
Lebanese, like remember everybody else that's around you.
Yeah.
This is also for them as well. And now I'm thinking, oh, I actually have to forgive some debts and it's going to be
Yes.
hard for me and it's going to hurt me. And
Yes.
so Jubilee economics is
Yeah.
not just a nice ideal, it's painful because I think I deserve what I have. So, how do we deal with the pain and the difficulty, the hardship of sacrifice when it comes to practicing Jubilee?
Well, and that was, I think, early on when my husband and I started to wrestle with it. We were living in Burundi, and that is a culture where where they lend money to each other. Here in America, debt, or in the West, debt is more impersonal. We tend to use banks and other mechanisms to access money. But I know in Burundi, money is very personal. And so you are actually more often than not getting money from your uncle, your mother. You're getting money from each other, and you are really beholden to each other. And so I was like, man, if we're going to take this seriously, like, there's a lot of people, just because we had access to like a Western salary, we didn't have a lot, but we had more than most of our family and our neighbors. And it was really hard to think about, are we really going to forgive those debts? What does this mean going forward? Because if word gets out that we forgive debts, right? But that is something that we had to wrestle with, is let's not expect these debts to be repaid. Let's try and practice this as best we can. Again, I still think there is this understanding of everything is not a one for one, so there are times, but the way that we loan money when we need to is very different. We loan what we know we can afford to lose. Where we're like, okay, you know, and at the same time, we are trying to help some of our friends, some of our younger folks, that's a learning opportunity, but we give very gentle, gentle way for them, to learn. But we've had to forgive a lot of personal debts in Burundi to try and practice this and to learn, what is that like? But like I said, with my girlfriend just this week, it's like, oh, well, I don't want her to go into debt. So how is there any way that we collaborate because we care about each other? It rewires the way you think about how money moves, and that it's not hoarded, which is so against my American sensibilities. But I really do think we are challenged to not hold each other in deeper cycles of debt.
I mean, there's a lot of things I think we've been arguing about, and especially in the United States in the last decade or so. One around race and reparations. People are like, well, that happened a long time ago and it wasn't my generation, so
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
don't need to pay anything now. So that was a long time ago. And these people, they weren't slaves, and so why would we pay them anything? And then we're having conversations around land. How far does it go back to like restore land to owners? Like, what does that look like, and
Mhm.
who owns the lands, and
Yeah.
how far back do we go? These are difficult questions, because people have been on this land that I'm on and that you're on for a long time ago that weren't us.
Mhm.
So how do we deal with things that are more, I don't know, like more ancient past than even the past 50 years, 2 generations deep? It's like more like 8 generations deep.
Yeah. Well, that's where I feel like, again, I'm not an expert you know, in some of these things. I think as a Jubilee practitioner, I really do think the more you start in the small ways to practice, you do start to kind of rewire the way you think. Like I notice my instinct, is different than it was 10 years ago. Because you start right as you practice, you rewire the way you understand. And I've watched people because I have friends in South Africa and I have friends up in Canada and places, other places. Well, and also friends in Israel and Palestine who are struggling with these are very real and present issues for them in ways that I feel like in America, we're not we talk about land, but I feel like my friends in Canada are really at a different place of having these conversations. And I hear, like, I heard a story of a woman who, a wonderful Mennonite community, and she recognized that she was on the land of, of a tribal land and of course, she inherited the land from her family. So, right, we're talking generations that this has been in her family. She and her aunts. I mean, but somewhere along the line, this land belonged to somebody else. And she didn't have kids, which made it, in a sense, easier because she wasn't depriving them of an inheritance, so to speak. But she recognized, oh, this actually isn't most deeply mine to keep or to decide what happens to, like, so in her will, what she did was she gave the land to the tribal community, to the elders for so that when I pass on, in a sense, this land is gonna go back to you, and you as tribal elders can decide how to use this land for your right, and to me, that was like, wow, now that is a Jubilee practitioner, right? She is with her own little bit of the story, her own little plot of land, she's like, "Okay, I'm gonna live here till I die, but this then has to go back, and I can do that." And like, a part of me is like, I'm more encouraged by these smaller stories because I think when we think systemic, it's very easy to say it's too big, it's too messy, and we shut down. And once we shut down, it's like we opt out, like, "Oh, it's too big," and we don't touch it. But on a smaller scale, I think then we start to see these little moves that we can be making to start to shift the ground. And I've heard stories similar to that, Palestine and Israel. I've heard stories like that in South Africa where, there there's I'm trying to remember the exact story of this family in South Africa where it was a Afrikaans family, so white family, and they recognized that, "Oh, like, we've had this land, and we have these people who've worked the land," a colored family. So they realized now they didn't decide to give their land away because they lived off the land and their jobs were all related to the land, but what they chose to do was they paid differently. Because they recognized we're not gonna pay them a low wage, we're actually gonna pay them a real living wage, like, that's something we can do. And then they decided, well, we're sending our kids to college. We're gonna pay for their kids to go to college. That is part of our way of contributing to their family's future, is that their kids will get to go to college just like our kids, and we will bear because we can afford it, we will pay that. So they're trying in their they I heard that story and I thought, well, they're trying in their own way. Now that wasn't giving the land back, but they cared about the wages of the parents, and they cared about the future of the kids. And to me, like, okay, this is where I say Jubilee requires us to be creative and, like Isaiah, to imagine how can it be different and how do I participate in that in jubilary ways?
I mean, it seems like everything that you're talking about now is we're trying to wrestle with what it looks like to live Jubilee and Jubilee economics. It feels like, how do I love my neighbor
Mhm.
as myself? It feels like another thing that Jesus says is like, love your neighbor. This is why Jesus
Yes.
said to the rich young ruler, like, well, what are the greatest commandments? It's love
Mhm.
your neighbor as yourself. That's so
So
loving our neighbor. How has that like really truly living out the command of loving your neighbor? How
right.
does that has that changed the way that you do development work in Burundi and seeing it as maybe even just seeing that we are all connected, we're
Mhm.
all made in the image of God, we're all like a part of this system together.
Mhm.
Did that shift at all how you did development work?
I am proud of the work that we have done over the last set of years. I'm proud because, my husband is probably much more jubilary in his imagination, and I have really learned alongside him. But yes, I mean, I think even the way he has handled the bank, like the fact that he's like, "I don't care. Right now, I don't care about the money. What I care about is that these people are fed and that they know they're okay and they know we're not gonna come after them for the money and put them out." Right? Like, yes, we had people we worked with in the States to get an influx of capital, because of course the money has to come and we have to deal with that side of it, but the impulse to care about each other. I think, in our development work, again, we've learned so much from Isaiah and the poetry of Isaiah and what I believe is a companion book, Lamentations, where part of being human is suffering these losses and creating space to lament together. And I think when I watched my husband that day, like, that he opened the gates and he sat for hours and he allowed himself to feel the pain with these women who had lost everything. Now, we might have been losing the bank, but we weren't losing everything in the same way they were. But he allowed himself to sit with them in that. And I tell you, it rewires you. And I noticed that in so many of the things we do in Burundi, so many of the initiatives that have been the most transformational have started with him going somewhere and crying with people and creating that space to lament together, to share that pain. And then it's like the spirit stirs something. Like, we weren't planning on doing a porridge factory, but look at I guess we're gonna do that now because, like, these surprising things are stirred in that place of lament. I think Bergman used to say that the lament is the seed bed of hope, that when we open ourselves up to our neighbors and their pain and the struggles of surviving, the spirit stirs things up and then we can do some transformational things together. And so I do think we approach our work understanding that these are our neighbors, or as they would say in the Old Testament, these are our kin. They are us. And so we have to treat them that way. And I think I know people who work for all those wonderful NGOs, the big ones that we see publicize and that have sponsorship programs and, you know, all that. And they do great work. And a lot of them are people we collaborate with. But I do think there's something about, I mean, Gustavo Gutierrez, the liberation theologian out of South America, had talked about, do you know the names? You talk about the poor, but do you know their names? And my husband, and I know some of them, but my husband knows a lot more. He knows the names of these people because they aren't just projects that we fund. These are people. And, we are right now struggling. The economy in Burundi is horrible right now. And really hard to run a bank and support people and their endeavors when the whole economy is collapsing. And recently we've had to make some decisions about whether or not we're going to lay some people off to stay viable. And I mean, I think he agonizes more than most because he doesn't see these as jobs that we can easily cut. He knows that each one of those people represents a family, and those families are going to be without, like, he definitely thinks, like, these are my neighbors, but these are 40% of the families that are part of this bank. Like, to him, it is very personal, and it is part of, I think, what makes the work we do deeply meaningful and special, but also on days like this, really hard, because we do everything, like, he's doing everything he can to figure out, well, can they work at the porridge factory, or do they have a skill set where we can move them over here and still keep them employed? But, yeah, it changes the way we work.
That's a huge thing to know people's names, know their families. That then changes the way that you do business. We live, at least in the West, we live in
Mm,
a machine that
yeah.
really is about production and more money for the top and for for corporations. How can we start to, as individuals in the Western empire, actually then start to practice some of these Jubilee practices and economics when we're part of the machine? Is there a way for us to be faithful and human even when the machine is trying to
Mhm.
run us to the ground?
Right. I'd say I'm sorry that I'm gonna say something political, but as a liberation theologian, I think you kind of expect that that's coming. But I do think our first vocation is to survive. I think we often forget that because in the West, we assume that we're all gonna survive this. But, in most of the world, it's not a given that you're gonna survive. Claude used to say, "That's why we have so many kids is because we know a lot of them aren't gonna make it." So you have as many as you can. But, you know, surviving is getting harder, and I think as we work, to survive and to care about each other, I think we have to just start recognizing that that survival happens with one another. Like, we have to be looking out not just for ourselves as Americans have been trained to do, but to look out for our communities, our neighborhoods, and so for me, that has changed the way that I vote. So I grew up in a Republican household in Southern California. And I was taught by very good evangelical parents that you vote with your pocketbook in mind. And that if everybody votes with their pocketbook in mind, we end up with the best result. And it took me a long time to unlearn that and think, wait a minute, I'm in a different social location than a lot of my neighbors. And I actually have a lot of neighbors. Now I live in Arizona. I'm in Arizona part of the time. A lot of my neighbors here are in mixed status families, are undocumented. They may pay into the system with their taxes, but they're not getting any services and they can't vote. So, you start the narrative starts to thicken when you start, oh, but wait a minute. There are people who are always going to be left out if that's the way that I vote. And so several elections ago, I started to think, what if I voted with my neighbors in mind? And I thought more about who is advocating for the kind of policies that are going to make this a better place for me and my neighbors together, that we are going to survive this season together. Fundamentally changes how I think about food policy and all sorts of other things in my own. Like I learned, my kids went to elementary school here in Arizona, and I got to know the office lady really well. And one day I learned from her that 50% of the kids at my local little suburban elementary school were on food assistance. And I just never, I was like, what? And it totally changed the way that I engaged with my school. I was donating like crazy. I was always sending the kids to school with 3 times as many supplies, 3 times as many Valentines, right, because I knew they need to be able to, the teachers need to be able to give this to the families who need, because not all my neighbors are making it. It changed how I supported my local food bank, like, right, because I recognized, oh, just because I'm doing okay doesn't mean all my neighbors are. So, right, how do I show up? So I think the how we vote and what policies we're willing to support, you know, it's not a small thing for those of us who have the ability to vote, to think about our neighbors. I was very concerned about all the things happening with SNAP benefits recently. I'm not on SNAP, but I know a lot of my neighbors are. So I was paying attention because I knew it mattered to their viability and therefore it matters to me. And so I was like, okay, we got to up what we're doing for the food bank. And do I need to be going to the local school and asking, if I can give you a little bit, can you give it to the people? Right. I'm trying to think, how do I tangibly, like in very tangible ways, show up for my neighbors? So, yes, the way that I vote, but also even just things like that. Like, how do these policies, how are they impinging upon the actual people in my neighborhood? And am I willing to to step in and help. I mean, I'm also out there on the streets protesting, so because I think that's another way that you show people, we're in it together.
Let's look and see the people around us, and
Mhm.
that then we can, through your protests, through
Mhm.
voting, we could actually advocate for our neighbors and the people around us, and actually then
Yeah.
do tangible things
Yeah.
with our schools and the people around us. So that is beautiful.
No.
If you could talk to your readers and the people that would read Jubilee Economics, what hope do you
Mm.
have for the people who read it? What hope do you have for this book?
I just hope that we are priming our imagination for a more jubilary kind of practice. While Jubilee is a concrete set of practices, it also is a set of practices that set our imagination on a different kind of trajectory. I think Isaiah does that so beautifully when he was imagining a new city, the way a city could work better, work differently. And Jubilee was absolutely part of what he was dreaming and imagining. And I think that we need more of that. As we are at a place where I think a lot of, some people say we are in late stage capitalism, we are right post capitalist. I mean, again, not an economist, but we all can see that the economy, and I would say economies, because I know the Burundian economy, I know right now the economy in Tanzania, I know the economy in Congo, like a lot of economies are struggling. What is going to kind of come out of the ash of what is eroding now? And man, we need some jubilary thinkers who are willing to say, let's try some different things. Let's be willing to try some different tools. I mean, back then the tools were about loans and mass debt forgiveness and letting people free if they were indentured, and the capacity to move land around. Okay, so what dials and levers are we able in a modern economy to imagine differently? I know some people are really looking at debt, medical debt, right? We have organizations that are doing amazing work for giving medical debt. I think conversations around what do you call it, our credit scores, and whether medical debt and accrued the credit scores that are connected to medical debt, should they be, because that's a big part of how we do money now. Should they count? Should they not? Well, like, they certainly are not biblical in terms of, like, they didn't have credit scores back then. But the idea, the imagination that we bring to say, okay, is this a mechanism we can rethink, and we can try different things to bring about more breathing room for people? Because if the big nut we have to crack is the weight of indebtedness and how that affects us as people, as neighbors, as communities, as national economies, we need a lot of different ways to imagine how to dismantle or disarm the ways that indebtedness hurts and harms us. So I think Jubilee is a great place to start getting a better sense of historically how we've dealt with debt, but then cracking open our imaginations for what are ways in my own life and in my own community, and people who are, I mean, there's a gentleman who wrote, 500 years of debt. He wrote The History of Debt. And at the end of this 500-year history, what does he say? I think that old practice from the Hebrews, the Jubilee, I think that's what we need to try. And he said, and I love that he was honest. He said, it's going to be messy. It's going to be messy. But out of the ashes, he believed, kind of like creative destruction, out of the ashes, something different, but that we maybe can't even imagine right now. That's part of the challenge. Is somebody says, well, Kelley, what do you want to see? I don't know. I mean, in a sense, we are all still in a place where we are on the verge of being able to actually imagine. As we see this start to not work, we can say, "Oh, so can we not just I don't wanna make anything great again. I don't wanna make Israel great again. I don't wanna make America. I want to imagine what is the new, the better, the next thing that is going to help us live better together." And I think Jubilee allows us to crack open. The challenge is to crack open our imaginations, but in very, very practical ways. So yeah, imagine, but not just like pie in the sky. Like, okay, then try it. Go out there and do it. Does it work? Why didn't it work? I mean, they even say some of the debt forgiveness for medical debt, some of it hasn't worked. Okay, why hasn't it worked? And the answer isn't don't do it. It's now let's do it better. Let's learn from what didn't work. because we know that debt is bad. So how do we manage that? So I would love to see readers feel like, okay, I'm willing to give it a try. I'm willing to imagine differently and to not be scared. I think a lot of us are scared at the thought that the economy could be wired in a different way. We come at it with a lot of fear, and it's like, what if we came at it with curiosity instead of fear? Like, what would it look like? You know? And then maybe some better policies, some better practices will come out of our curiosity as opposed to our fear.
That's great. Well, Kelley, your book, Jubilee Economics, is available anywhere books are sold. People could go and get it, wrestle with it, and start to imagine a new future and a better future. What comes
No.
next? What does it look like to actually practice these things? And how do we imagine something where we could actually survive together in a way that it doesn't look
Yes.
like crushing
Oh,
debt for everyone, but it
yes.
looks like Jubilee. So, Kelley, this was fantastic. Is there anywhere you'd like to point people to? How could they connect with you? What you're doing? Where would you like to point people to?
Oh, I actually, I stay at home with my corgis often, so you wanna come play with my little corgis. No, I'm on Instagram, so that's kinda where that's the platform I can kinda handle is, on Instagram. Um, I do have a website, but, I'm not really kinda out there online a whole lot. I like to, like, be here with all the books and doing all the work, and working with my husband on our stuff in Burundi, but Instagram would probably be the best place.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Kelley, thank you for this conversation. It was a pleasure to have you on. And let's see Jubilee in the world.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out, share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.